Hello, everybody, and welcome to Psyched Out, a podcast focused on all things psychology like psychological thrillers, unethical experiments, true crime cults, and more. I am your host, Emily, and for those who don't know, I have a bachelor's degree in forensic psychology and a background in law enforcement. This helps me provide unique insight on some of the world's most famous cases, movies, and events. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the Michael Jackson verdict, a documentary recently released on Netflix. Those of you who follow me on YouTube as well as TikTok may have seen the 10-minute analysis I did immediately after watching the 3-part series. I was consequently inspired to do a much deeper analysis and include some additional research into Michael's childhood and his home life. As mentioned, I am not biased one way or the other towards Michael Jackson. He was well before my time. I was born in 2000, so I was a wee little baby, and I honestly knew very little about him. I would say I was aware of his skin condition, how the media was like super inappropriate asking him questions about that. I've seen a lot of those clips on TikTok. I was aware that he came from a large family and that he had some type of assault allegations against him. I didn't really know the specificity behind that. And then I also remember the news of his death and how really concerned and enamored the public was with what happened. Again, I was really too little to kind of understand what all of that was. So I don't really have a dog in this race. I'll be honest, at the time, I really had difficulty grasping who Michael Jackson was because at that time, I didn't really know the level of fame that he had. I don't think I'd even heard a single Michael Jackson song, to be honest. So again, I'm not biased one way or the other. I'm just going based on the information that I have seen and have acquired. I know many people are in one camp or the other, and they either firmly believe that he's guilty or firmly believe that he's innocent. I'm not here to say he's guilty or innocent. The court said that he was not guilty, so we're going to go based on what the court says, whether you agree or disagree. That unfortunately, that's just how legal proceedings work. What I'm going to do is analyze the case itself from a very broad general perspective, as well as Michael and his own behaviors. But before we do that, before we jump on in, I do have a couple of announcements to make, so bear with me here. The first is that I have created a business email, which is psychedoutpodcast@gmail.com. Capital P in psyched, capital OUT in out, capital P in podcast, and then @gmail.com. I would love to do a fan mail episode at least once a month, depending on the influx of emails. So feel free to send an email with questions, topics, fun facts, etc., whatever it is you wish for a chance to be featured in an episode. You guys have been a fantastic community, and I want you to feel included in all of this and really kind of foster that relationship, not only with me to you guys, but you guys amongst yourselves. I think it would just be a really fun idea. On top of this, the podcast is entirely free. I'm not going to monetize that side of things because I am monetized on TikTok and YouTube, and also the podcasting platform I work through has said that my content is not safe for some reason, despite it being presented in an educational manner. So if you guys really want to support me, please consider, following my other channels, following my YouTube and my TikTok and things like that. You don't have to. The support, though, it really does mean the world to me, and it helps me continue to make content like this. I very clearly have a full-time job in patrol, so that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. So being able to do this really is a privilege, but it also takes a lot of effort and a lot of energy. But that is all I have as far as news. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and jump into the episode. We're going to start with a quote, something that Michael once said, which was, "My childhood was taken away from me. There was no Christmas. There was no birthdays. It was not a normal childhood, nor the normal pleasures of childhood. Those were exchanged for hard work, struggle, and pain, and eventually material and professional success. But as an awful price, I cannot recreate that part of my life, nor would I change any part of my life," end quote. I think this is a very pertinent quote for Michael's entire outlook on life, and honestly, his entire story as a whole. I think these few sentences really provide some of the clearest insight we have on who Michael is, what his thought process was, and what his life was like. It's really easy to look at celebrities a lot of the times and think, they have everything that they could ever want without really acknowledging where it is that they may have come from. So that's what we're going to do right now, is kind of talk about where Michael started in his journey through life. So Michael grew up in Gary, Indiana, with I believe it was 8 siblings, one of which had passed away. I think there's a set of twins in the family, and one had sadly passed away. So he was one of 10 siblings, but one of 8 as far as living siblings, if that makes sense. And they all grew up in a 2 bedroom house, which is astronomically cramped. I can't imagine that. So I have 5 siblings myself, and I think we would all probably kill each other if we had to do that. We've done that on vacation a few times, and it's always really contentious. So I can only imagine how that would have been for Michael and his family. Now, Michael's father, Joseph Joe Jackson, had to sacrifice his own musical pursuits in order to support his large family, on occasion working up to 3 jobs at a time, which is insane. But again, I mean, you have 10 kids, so you kind of have to do what you can. Now, Michael's mother, Catherine, was a stay at home mother, a homemaker. She really looked after the kids, but she also encouraged them to pursue music. A lot of them were very musically gifted, very musically talented. Obviously, that came with a lot of practice as well, but they did have a bit of a natural propensity for it. So she really hunkered down and said, you know what, like if this is something that you guys want to pursue, I'll help you do that. On top of that, Catherine was a devout Jehovah's Witness. And for those who don't know, Jehovah's Witness is a specific sort of subsect or spin off of Christian religion. We'll discuss the general belief system in a moment and kind of what that means, but just keep that in mind. Inevitably, Michael and his siblings became the Jackson Five, and Joe became a manager for the family more than he was a dad. Granted, he was working a lot anyways, so how present he was within the family, who really knows? Michael stated at one point, quote, "I grew up on stage. I grew up in nightclubs. When I was 7, 8 years old, I was in nightclubs. I saw striptease girls take off all their clothes. I saw fights break out. I saw people throw up on each other. I saw adults act like pigs," end quote. Michael really entered an adult world well before he was old enough to properly digest the things that he was seeing. I mean, there's a reason that we don't want children exposed to sex and violence before an age appropriate point in their life, and that's because it can be very damaging, especially when they may be seeing things and feeling things and not really knowing the best way to cope with that, to handle that, what it even means. And we also have to keep in mind that all of the stuff he's seeing is in direct conflict with his religious beliefs, so I can only imagine how that must have felt. Jehovah's Witnesses follow all 66 books of the Bible, along with their teachings, believing that it's proper to not celebrate birthdays or certain holidays like Christmas, avoid political involvement, and maintain religious neutrality. They also believed in avoiding sexual promiscuity and sexual immorality, which is pretty stereotypical across a lot of religions, especially Christian religions. And then Jehovah's Witnesses also avoid service in the military, and this partially stems from their belief that the only person who should be worshipped or followed to that extent is Jehovah, aka God. So they don't even believe that Jesus should be worshipped, only God. Whereas, like, when I grew up in the church and I myself am Christian, it's you believe in God and Jesus and the Holy Trinity, and you can worship God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit. But Jehovah's Witnesses don't do that. And in general, Jehovah's Witnesses are expected to behave honestly and with integrity, which is great. I approve of that. And they are directed to avoid practices considered sinful while maintaining commitment to spiritual discipline. So in all, not bad. I know a lot of people tend to, crap on Jehovah's Witnesses because they have that sacred understanding, or like, I don't know what the correct word is. They view blood as something that's very, very sacred, and that it should not be put into the body. And so, there's been cases where like a kid's dying in the hospital and they need a blood transfusion, and the parents are like, no, it's against my religious beliefs. And a lot of people really latch on to that. But in general, I would say that they're probably not the worst religious subsect that we could be focusing on. To be honest, like, even myself being Christian, there's a lot of really, really, really shitty things that Christians have done. So, like, be fair when you point the finger at them, because I think there's definitely worse things that could be done. Anywho, given these principles of Michael's religion, his family's religion, and how deeply that was ingrained in his childhood, I imagine that Michael's visits to nightclubs to perform resulted in a bit of a culture shock. To make matters worse, there were allegations, and honestly, I think it's pretty safe to say, of physical abuse, verbal and emotional abuse. I've heard that there were some rumors of sexual abuse. I don't know how accurate that is. A lot of people were talking about it on Reddit, but like I'm not going to get my sources from Reddit because that's a bit iffy in my opinion. But regardless, these allegations were all made in reference to Joe and his children, including statements where Joe would chase and beat his children for the smallest mistakes in their rehearsals. Michael at one point stated, quote, "I just remember my mom scream, 'Joe, you're gonna kill him. You're gonna kill him. Stop.' I was so fast he couldn't catch me half the time, but when he would catch me, oh my God, it was bad. It was really bad." End quote. Joe, naturally, denied these allegations, stating that he never beat his children, he only spanked them, and then stated Catherine was more responsible for physical violence than he was because he was working 3 jobs and he wasn't home. Which, like, good job, Joe. I'm really glad that you threw your wife under the bus for your shitty behavior. You're a real man, a real winner, but I guess that's to be expected. It makes me shake my head. And then in defense of the beating allegations, Joe would say, quote, "Look what I came out with. I came out with some kids that everybody loved all over the world and they treated everybody right." End quote. As if that somehow, like, miraculously makes his behavior okay and has turned him into this upstanding father and individual where it's like, oh, I may have beat the shit out of my kids, but they didn't turn out to be awful pieces of shit. And it's like, listen, Joe, that's not really the point, and also maybe you shouldn't beat your kids. Like, I was spanked growing up because at the time there wasn't as much of a dialogue about, like, the impact of spanking and things like that, and I remember being very, very scared, to get spanked. At the end of the day, I think it whipped me into shape a little bit. I personally would never hit my kids, but, I would hear stories of my dad being like, "Well, if you think this is bad, when I was your age, I would get the belt, yada, yada, yada." So I do think there's something to be said that at the time it was a cultural thing, right? Where there wasn't so much of a talk about, well, is it appropriate to be doing this to a child? Granted, we have now developed as a society and that's kind of been put on the back burner, thankfully. But I do think it's very, very likely that all of this happened just because when you look at the time period, that stuff was happening. So Joe can deny it all he wants. I mean, if we're being honest, he did do all of that. So whatever. Anywho, we'll get into the psychological impact of child abuse in a moment, but keep this in mind because we're actually going to circle back to Michael's religion and his childhood. Not only was Michael forced to acknowledge adult behavior and adult violence at such a young age, he was also able to notice how different the world was around him due to his religious belief system. He was able to observe, others celebrating Christmas or having birthday parties, and he was able to understand that it was honestly innocent in nature, but it was something that he was told was bad for him and something that he couldn't participate in because it was a sinful practice. On top of this, Michael already had a very isolated childhood because, I mean, he was having to battle racism. Racism was still a very big thing. But on top of that, he was also impoverished. There was just a lot going on. There was also the abuse. All of this was happening simultaneously. And so he was even more isolated by his own religion as well. Um, it really just was a cocktail of misfortune. That's the best way that I can put it. And one of the few times people can really come together regardless of circumstances, belief systems, backgrounds. A lot of times that's for holidays or birthday parties. And Michael essentially had no sense of community outside of his own family because of the way that he was raised and the belief system that he had. And this is naturally going to stunt social skills and a way for somebody to integrate comfortably into society. And this permeated his childhood and carried into adulthood when he was swamped with fame, leading to even further isolation and an inability to integrate into society the way that a normal individual would. At the end of the day, there were very few people that Michael could relate to because of the strange circumstances of his childhood. And if we couple that with the style of abuse inflicted on Michael, it makes sense why Michael struggled in so many emotional and social aspects of his adult life. Because when we look at Joe as a parent, we can really target his style of abuse as being centered, one, on isolation, and then two, on terror. The isolation being in Michael not having much of a social life, not having social interaction with his peers, with extended family and relatives or others, by limiting, like Joe limiting Michael's freedom to, you have to practice at these specific times. If you mess up, you get beat, things like that. Then we have to look at the terror aspect of it, which is found in Joe's insistence to place unrealistic expectations not only on Michael but his siblings, and then threatening them with violence for failing to meet those unrealistic expectations. So, again, the beatings for mistakes in rehearsal. And I think part of this abuse stems from Joe having to give up his own musical dreams and then turning around and using his children as a stand-in for what he wanted for himself. And like, I can understand how that would be hard. Maybe your life gets thrown off kilter because, Catherine gets pregnant and you have a baby, but you chose to have 10 children. Like, no one was making you have that much sex. You did that to yourself. And it just feels wrong to almost hold that against your children because you didn't get to fulfill the dreams that you wanted. Like, nobody held a gun to Joe's head and said, you need to get married and you need to have 10 kids. If he really wanted to, he could have pursued the career that he wanted. So it just feels wrong and spiteful to then turn around and be like, well, I couldn't have what I wanted, so I'm going to hold my kids to a standard that's really, really awful, and they'll never be able to meet my expectations, but that's okay because I get to live vicariously through them. And then consequently damaging your children because of that. It's just ridiculous. But again, it's of the time because men didn't really know how to handle their feelings. And men still don't really know how to handle their feelings a lot of the time. So I guess who knows how much progress we've actually made as far as that goes. But anywho, as for the long-term effects of child abuse, we can see psychological issues just in brain matter alone. Studies have found chemical imbalances and cognitive delays in children, now adults, who were abused in childhood, resulting in social difficulties as well as attachment issues. And the studies that I read, there were a bunch of technical terms for different parts of the brain. I'm not really going to get into that specifically because while I do have a degree in forensic psychology, I'm not a neurologist. So even that is a little bit of scientific jargon for me. And if I can't understand that shit, I'm not going to expect you guys to understand that. So just know the brain changes, chemical imbalances, abuse is bad, makes your noggin develop not so great. Now, in some cases, children who experience rejection or neglect are more likely to develop antisocial personality traits. Now, when I say antisocial personality traits, don't confuse that with antisocial personality disorder. You can have antisocial personality traits without having antisocial personality disorder. So just keep that in mind. And one of those traits is self-isolation, which is something that we see in Michael's, not only his childhood, but his adulthood as well. And then on top of social issues, abuse is shown to be responsible for other detrimental factors in the victim's life. Who would have guessed? Studies have found that 80% of 21-year-olds that were abused as children met criteria for at least one psychological disorder. Now, I didn't do a whole lot of background as far as Michael's entire extensive career as a musician because that's just a lot. That dude was a busy bee. But I mean, I think it's pretty safe to say he had some psychological issues. So that statistic isn't too surprising. On top of that, abused children were also far more likely to abuse substances. Again, there were some substance abuse issues when it came to Michael. I'm not going to get into all of that specifically, but another statistic that's not too surprising. In general, abuse or adults who experience extensive child abuse have a much more difficult time handling a point of crisis in their life. They may react inappropriately in a time of high stress due to past abuse, which ultimately cripples their ability to emotionally regulate and understand that maybe a situation that feels like a crisis isn't, or they're not able to properly assess a situation that feels like a crisis and is a crisis and then be able to cope with it. And if that weren't enough of a shit sandwich, abuse often impacts a victim's ability to gauge who they can or cannot trust. In some instances, people will close themselves off and trust no one, becoming emotionally unavailable, protective, and then just further self-isolate. Not great. On the flip side, others will trust anyone and everyone, believing that other people couldn't possibly be as bad as the abuser or even see other people as stand-in saviors. And this leads to victims being manipulated and taken advantage of. In general, abuse victims struggle to maintain relationships and can often be re-victimized due to their skewed interpretation of familial and interpersonal relationships. Just a bit of an anecdotal story. My little brother, he's biologically my cousin, very abusive childhood. We ended up adopting him. I love him to death. He's a cutie patootie. But when he was very little, he would go around and talk to complete and total strangers and act like they were his best friends. And he thought that everybody was a good guy, everybody was a good person. And, growing up, my parents very clearly taught me stranger danger. And I remember being surprised by this, but looking back on it, it makes sense. He had that opposite effect of, instead of being isolated, not trusting anybody, he was overly trusting because he saw other people as like good individuals who couldn't possibly be as evil and messed up as my aunt, and as, in a weird way, these forms of saviors. So like, I've seen this type of behavior firsthand. Granted, it was more in a child than an adult, but even now that he is growing up, he'll be 18 soon here, I still see remnants of that behavior where it's like, oh, you know, hey, buddy, that person really wants to take advantage of you. And he can't really see it until you explain it and break it down to him. So it's something that's very real, something that I have seen firsthand. Is that to say that every abuse victim ever has experienced something like that? No, but it does happen. Now, what does all of this have to do with Michael and the court case against him for the allegations of sexual abuse? Now, that is a great question. Really quick, though, I do just like, so that we're all on the same page, I'm not going to get into the extensive detail about the court case itself. That feels a little bit redundant. I feel like it's been beat to death. There's countless documentaries out there. If you want to watch it, go for it. I will discuss some of the facts as they pop up if they're pertinent, but it's not going to be in like a super detailed chronological order of events. If that's something that you're wanting, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but that's not going to be happening in this video. So, Michael, as we know, had a ranch called Neverland. Interesting name. Personally, I'm a huge fan of Peter Pan, but I don't know if I would name my ranch Neverland. That in and of itself feels like weirdly predatory, but I digress. In general, Michael was viewed by the public as being odd and overly eccentric, with a strange propensity for childlike activities and spending a lot of time with children. And that's how we got into the whole mess to begin with the Arvizo family alleging sexual abuse against their son Gavin and Star by Michael. An investigation ensued along with a court case, as one would expect. And at face value, I can see why people were so off-put by Michael's behavior. An adult having an entire ranch with like a fairgrounds, a zoo, etc. is off-putting, especially with it being directly connected to the house or being directly on the property with the house. There's not even really a degree of separation there. So again, I get it. And then obviously it's going to be off-putting for a lot of people when you continuously invite children over and spend a lot of time with them. However, when you look at Michael's childhood, like with the Jehovah's Witness issues, the isolation, the abuse, and honestly just a lack of identity within his own family, it kind of makes sense, right? Like he really didn't have a childhood at all. So him seeking out joy and happiness through events and pleasures he would have liked to have had as a child makes a lot of sense. And being able to have parties or go to the fair or engage in events he really didn't otherwise, I mean, it's not really that different than me like buying myself collectibles, as you can see on my bookshelves, or buying me Pokemon cards because I have the money to do so now. He just happened to have like millions of dollars, which I can only fathom. I don't even know what I would do with all of that money. I would probably buy so many Pokemon cards. But yeah, I wasn't allowed to have that stuff as a kid because my family couldn't afford it. We weren't like super broke and poor, but we weren't financially super secure either. And honestly, it would be a normal behavior if it was just isolated to Michael himself. The problem is that it goes too far, right? There's some unspoken rule, unspoken boundary that is crossed. Because at the end of the day, Michael's an adult. And no matter how much he wants to recapture an idea of childhood joy, he's really not going to be able to achieve that. And so he thinks, well, the next best thing to experience this joy is to bring joy to another child and participate that way, which to him makes sense. He's being involved with children, he's being a good person, and he's able to fill that emotional need for himself. However, there's a severe lack of boundaries here in all of this, to be honest. And that's really what it boils down to. The documentary on Netflix states Michael shared a bed with the boys. Others have told me that he slept on the floor. At the end of the day, I don't care if it was on the bed or not. Um, he never should have been alone with a child in a bedroom of all places, especially when there's guest houses everywhere. At the end of the day, Michael was setting himself up for something like this to happen. Like it was going to be a matter of time. It's inevitable, right? So, while I don't really think Michael is a sexual predator in and of itself, I do think his background set him up for failure because he was using children to fulfill emotional needs he couldn't otherwise fulfill on his own, which is inappropriate in and of itself. There is no reason that a grown man, let alone a celebrity, should be alone in a bedroom with children, whether that's sharing a bed with them or sleeping on the floor. It shouldn't have happened. You, as an adult, should not be relying on children to fulfill the needs that you have, whether that is emotional or sexual. This also harkens back to my discussion of abuse impacting interpersonal relationships. It appeared that Michael struggled to connect with a lot of adults, and he tended to have a more closed off relationship or closed off persona focused on self protection and a setting of boundaries. That is with a lot of adults. But then in other instances, we see him be overly trusting and, quite frankly, naive. He trusted people that he really shouldn't have, which again is how he got himself in hot water with Bashir's documentary. The problem is that due to the abuse he experienced and the fundamental lack of a childhood, even being managed by his own father for so long, Michael wasn't really exposed to the consequences of misinterpreting interpersonal relationships or really being able to identify a person's ulterior motives. I think partially why he was so comfortable with children is because he didn't have to worry about the social aspect of things as much, because children tend to be more honest, and when children do lie, they suck at it. So there's that. That said, Michael using children to help himself feel better really isn't a good choice, no matter how subconscious it may have been for him. And I think part of this stems from the fact that socially, celebrities weren't really seen as people, which we've done a little bit better about over time, I think. And correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was way worse back then. Celebrities were much more likely to be viewed as objects rather than individuals or as a person. I also think that we have done a much better job at discussing mental health, even amongst celebrities, than back then. So there really wasn't much of an open discussion being had around Michael and his issues in a way that would have been productive or beneficial, because the media really just didn't give a shit and they were being as sensational as possible, which is still a problem today. But I digress. So Michael also did not do himself any favors by constantly having kids around, because even if he wasn't sexually abusing them, he then creates an environment that's incredibly enticing to real sexual predators. He has made a playground for them. So even if he himself is not victimizing children in a sexual way, he has now created a way for other people to do that. And it may be unintentional, but he's sort of aiding and abetting as far as that goes. Like I said, maybe unintentional, but you'll understand why I'm saying that in a second. So, in the documentary, one of the pieces of evidence, I say it in air quotations, comes from a man named Frank who grew up with Michael as a father figure. Now, inside of this bag he tries to dispose of is a magazine, and there's all these pornos circled, and these pornos were allegedly ordered, and what they were videos of sexual conduct with little boys. Now, Frank, when asked about it, stated that he ordered it for himself and for Michael, which is easy to do, because Michael is already under investigation for the sexual assault allegation, so why not just point the finger at him? Now, I think that Frank 100% is a sexual predator. I don't know what ended up happening with him, but again, the ranch in and of itself is a predator's playground. On top of that, we also have to look at the fact that Michael did have an interaction with Epstein. Michael, as many know, is in the Epstein files photographed with Epstein. If you followed my Epstein investigations when I was doing it, I said, to Michael's credit, he does look uncomfortable. But what we have to acknowledge here is, while I don't think Michael sexually abused children, you have to look at it from Epstein's perspective, right? Here's a multimillionaire man with a theme park ranch with tons of kids around him all the time. Epstein probably thought Michael was like him and into little kids and wanted to be part of the shindig. Remember, Epstein had a massive network of people who fit that type of profile. To be honest, like, you don't accidentally meet other pedophiles; you seek them out. So, in Michael's emotional and social stuntedness, he's allowing predators to use and abuse the paradise he created. Now, I'm not saying there's any connection between Neverland and Epstein, but I'm saying that may have been why Epstein was so eager to meet Michael. It just doesn't look good as a whole. And it's quite frankly irresponsible, in my opinion. Now, I will admit, hindsight is 2020, so I'm going to be devil's advocate for myself here. And speaking of devil's advocate, at the time Michael was on trial, the American public wasn't used to sex scandals of this caliber, right? So this was basically Epstein before Epstein, Diddy before Diddy, and Weinstein before Weinstein. There's a fair chance that if this happened today, things would be different because we've seen so many of these scandals before. To be honest with you, the amount of overlap between Michael's case and like Epstein's case and Diddy's case is kind of concerning. And if we're being objective, which is the goal here, again, I'm not one way or the other like pro Michael, anti Michael. Michael did groom children. It wasn't for sexual reciprocation as much as it was for emotional reciprocation and fulfillment, but it was still child grooming. If you've been around my channel for a while, you'll know about my deep dive into the psychology and pathology of grooming. And while most of the time it's for sexual purposes, that is not always the case. And when you look at what Michael did and what Epstein did, there's a lot of overlap there as well. Taking in poor families, becoming father figures to kids who otherwise didn't have a dad, providing gifts, trips, paying for family needs, courting the family as well as the child. It's all in child grooming. And again, I don't think Michael was a raging sexual predator the way that Epstein is, but this is the same blueprint and the exact same playbook. And whether it's for sexual purposes or emotional purposes, it's still wrong. And I understand that he wanted to help people. I understand that he was very I can't think of the word off the top of my head, but he did a lot of charity work. I get that. That's also why I do the job that I do. Why I have donated funds from, my monetization on YouTube and TikTok to different charities. I get that. But you also have to set boundaries, which Michael struggled with, again, as I mentioned before, likely due to his childhood. So this was all just a very perfect storm for him in a very unfortunate manner. But Michael, at the end of the day, he didn't do himself any favors either because he never should have been caught alone around a kid ever again after the first lawsuit. Like, he should have used that as a wake-up call and just protected himself. It really just shouldn't have happened. And quite frankly, he just shot himself in the foot. And it's hard not to feel frustrated by it because it just seems so predictable. Now, when it comes to Gavin, as the documentary shows him with Michael, because this is another point of interest that a lot of people have, they view that interaction as intimate, which it is. But it doesn't come across as sexually intimate. We have to remember that Gavin survived cancer because of Michael. There's going to be a level of gratitude and intimacy there because of that bond between them. If I was dying of cancer and some multimillionaire came and said, hey, I'm going to pay for all of your treatments that your family can't otherwise afford, I'm going to save your life, there is going to be a level of an emotional intimacy and bond there. That doesn't necessarily mean it's sexual, right? So yes, people are correct in saying, that's a little intimate, but I don't think they're correct in saying that's sexual. They slept together. I think a lot of that was painted in a way to be what people wanted it to. Like, people are going to see what they want to see. So if somebody suggests to you that's sexual in nature, they're going to look at it that way, which I think ended up working in my favor because when I saw that portion of the documentary, I was like, well, yeah, that's intimate, but I'm not looking at this like, oh my God, they totally slept together. I'm looking at this as like, well, yeah, that kid's going to be a little more close to Michael because he was dying of cancer and Michael saved his life. Like, to me, it just wasn't what people are wanting it to be. That's just my take on that. But again, devil's advocate, Michael never should have been alone there with Gavin in that interview. I mean, if I'm being honest, at this point, I feel like I'm kind of beating a dead horse, but I almost have to because, like, you guys can clearly see how much of his child influenced his behavior and his poor decision making as an adult. I'd say I've laid that out pretty good. And what sucks is that part of it isn't his fault, and part of it very much is his fault. Because as an adult, it is your responsibility to adjust to the world around you, to recognize your faults and your deficits. Again, back then, that wasn't as much of an easy task to do because there wasn't as much open dialogue and as many resources. I get that. But I am frustrated with all of this. Additionally, another point worth exploring, even if it is brief, is that Michael really lacked a sense of identity, especially in the early parts of his life. He was one of 10 kids. And then after he was one of 10 kids, he was one part of a 5-kid music group. That has to be hard, right? I, as I mentioned, have a large family myself. And finding out who you are is difficult enough when you're not in an abusive household and confined by very strict religious guidelines, and then being part of 10 kids. Making it out into the real world, having to deconstruct all of that would leave a lot of people floundering. And as a result, I think Michael really latched onto the superstar persona because that's really all he knew. I don't think he was given the proper amount of time to explore himself as an individual and really build himself up to have more of a sense of self-esteem, to grow properly as an adult. And he was there, like, as I mentioned, socially and emotionally stunted. I think it really limited his ability to ever connect with people because how many people can relate to his specific set of circumstances? Nobody. Some people become famous overnight, but like when you look at his childhood and the way that he became famous, there's no other story really like it, at least that I'm aware of. At the end of the day, it's all a bunch of very tragic circumstances that culminated in a media frenzy. I think throughout Michael's entire career, the media was just a set of piranhas that asked him a bunch of inappropriate questions. I know a lot of people asked him about his plastic surgery, why he was white and not black anymore, if he still considered himself black. It was gross. It's disgusting. And I hate it. I do think that the investigation itself needed to happen because that's what should have been done in the Epstein case, to be honest. But I do think at the end of the day, the jury made the right call. Because as I was watching the documentary and being on the legal side of things myself, having made arrests, having taken a bunch of reports, like you have to be pretty damn certain of something. And I just think that the prosecution really came up short. I really do. Do I think it would be different if it was tried today? Yeah, I think there probably would have been a lot more evidence, either for or against Michael. I'm not really sure which way that would go. But it would be interesting to see how that played out today. But I do think the jury made the right call. I myself would not have felt comfortable convicting him with the amount of reasonable doubt that there was. In summary, I do believe that Michael had an emotionally inappropriate relationship with children that stemmed from his own lack of identity, his childhood, and a lifetime of abuse. Michael did groom kids, not for sexual reciprocation, but for emotional reciprocation. And to just live vicariously through their experiences. And in a weird way, it's not too different from what Joe did with Michael as far as living through him and his musical success. It's just a really messed up cycle that has continued to perpetuate itself. It happens all the time. It just sucks. It really does. This type of stuff, it's very hard to get out of that cycle. But yeah, if you guys want to watch the documentary, it is on Netflix. I will say it does a decent job in giving the defense, some credit as well as the prosecution. I will say it's probably a little more prosecution heavy than defense heavy, but this is just my analysis. At the end of the day, we're never going to truthfully know one way or the other, but I think looking at it, I feel comfortable in saying that yes, there was an inappropriate relationship. No, it wasn't sexual. Yes, it was emotional. Yes, it shouldn't have happened. Yes, there were a lot of issues there. And yes, it really stemmed from Michael's childhood. But that is all I really have to say on that matter. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. As I mentioned, your support is fantastic. Like I said, I have my business email if you guys want to reach out. Um, let me know. I will try to do a fan mail episode either at the end of this month or the next month, depending on the influx of emails that I get. But the email itself will be down in the description. And then my primary sources will be in the description as well. Keep in mind that I read a lot before making these videos. And then I just kind of keep what I think are the better sources and post those in the description. But that is all I have. Please stay safe out there, guys, especially this summer. Crazy stuff happens over summer. So please take care of each other. And as always, stay psyched out.